Orlando, Florida, March 17, 1997. A Monday morning that began like any other in the sprawling suburbs east of downtown, where strip malls give way to modest ranch homes and the humidity hangs thick even before dawn. By noon that day, 23-year-old Michelle Samuels would be dead. By nightfall, her two small children would be sleeping in their grandmother's house, asking when mommy was coming home. And for the next 7 years, the man who killed her would sleep beside another woman, raise other children, live another life entirely. The question that would haunt investigators, prosecutors, and those who knew the family was not whether he had done it. The question was why it took so long for anyone to believe he could. The neighborhood off Chickasaw Trail in East Orlando was the kind of place where people moved for affordability and space, not charm. Built in the late 80s during Florida's construction boom, the houses were single-story boxes with stucco exteriors painted in muted pastels, beige, pale yellow, faded mint green. The lawns were mostly bahia grass, hardy and coarse, dotted with sandspores that clung to children's socks. Live oaks draped with Spanish moss lined the main roads, but the side streets were newer, treeless, exposed to the unrelenting sun. By March, the winter tourists had begun their exodus north, and the locals reclaimed the highways and theme parks. The air smelled of cut grass and distant orange groves, though the groves were disappearing year by year, swallowed by suburbs just like this one. Michelle Samuels lived at 4382 Timber Ridge Court with her husband of 4 years, Robert Samuels, and their 2 children, Kayla, age 3, and Brandon, 18 months old. Michelle was small-framed, barely 5'2", with dark blonde hair she wore pulled back in a ponytail most days. She worked part-time at a Walgreens on Colonial Drive, stocking shelves and running the register during evening shifts. Her coworkers described her as quiet, polite, always on time. She never complained, even when her husband showed up unannounced at the store, waiting by the pharmacy section until her shift ended, watching. Robert Samuels was 26, a construction worker who framed houses for a contractor based in Kissimmee. He was tall, over 6 feet, with a thick build and calloused hands. Those who knew him said he was charming when he wanted to be, quick with a joke, good at fixing things, the kind of guy who'd help you move furniture or jump your car battery. But there was something else, too. A quickness to anger, a need to know where his wife was at all times. Neighbors heard arguments through the thin walls late at night, voices rising and falling, then silence. Monday, March 17th began unremarkably. Robert left for work before dawn, his white Ford F-150 pulling out of the driveway at 5:47. A neighbor, Mrs. Dolores Chen, who suffered from insomnia and often watched the street from her kitchen window, noted the time. She would remember this detail later. Michelle woke with the children around 7. She fed them cereal, Cheerios for Kayla, mashed banana for Brandon. She dressed Kayla in denim overalls and a pink shirt. Brandon wore a onesie with cartoon bears. The television played Sesame Street in the living room. The morning was warm, 74 degrees by 8 o'clock, with high clouds that promised rain later. Michelle had the day off from Walgreens. She planned to take the children to the playground at Blanchard Park, then stop by her mother's house in Winter Park. She told this to her mother, Diane Forrester, during a phone call at 8:32 a.m. The call lasted 4 minutes. Diane would replay that conversation in her mind thousands of times in the years that followed. Michelle's voice had been light, ordinary. She mentioned that Robert had been in a good mood that morning, that he'd kissed her goodbye, that maybe things were getting better. At 9:15 a.m., Michelle loaded the children into her 1994 Honda Civic, parked in the carport beside the house. Kayla carried her favorite stuffed rabbit, its ears worn soft from constant handling. Brandon clutched a sippy cup of apple juice. Michelle buckled them into their car seats, Kayla behind the passenger seat, Brandon behind the driver. She started the engine. The radio came on, tuned to a country station. She adjusted the rearview mirror. She never left the driveway. At 9:47 a.m., Robert Samuel's F-150 pulled back into the driveway at 4382 Timber Ridge Court. Mrs. Chen saw this too. She thought it odd. He never came home during the workday. The truck parked beside the Honda. Robert got out. He walked to the driver's side of the Honda and opened the door. Michelle turned to look at him. Mrs. Chen could not hear what was said, but she saw Michelle's expression change. She saw Robert reach in. Then Mrs. Chen's phone rang, her daughter calling from Tallahassee, and she turned away from the window. When she looked back, perhaps 90 seconds later, the Honda's driver door was closed. The truck was still there. Everything looked still. At 11:04 a.m., Robert Samuels called 911 from the landline inside the house. The call lasted 1 minute and 37 seconds. His voice on the recording was steady, almost flat. He reported that his wife was dead. He said he'd come home to check on her because she hadn't answered his calls. He said he found her in the garage, slumped in the driver's seat of the Honda. He said the car was still running. He said the garage door had been closed. He said it looked like she'd tried to kill herself. The Orange County Sheriff's deputies arrived at 11 a.m. They found Michelle Samuels in the driver's seat of the Honda Civic, unresponsive. The car was parked inside the single-car garage. The engine was off. Robert said he'd turned it off when he found her. The garage door was open. Robert said he'd opened it to let out the fumes. Kayla and Brandon were in the living room, watching television. Kayla was still holding her rabbit. Brandon had fallen asleep on the carpet. The house smelled faintly of exhaust. Paramedics pronounced Michelle dead at the scene at 11:26. Preliminary assessment indicated carbon monoxide poisoning. There were no visible signs of trauma, no defensive wounds, no ligature marks. Her body was still warm. Within an hour, the house at 4382 Timber Ridge Court was cordoned off with yellow tape. Crime scene investigators photographed the garage, the Honda, the interior of the house. They measured the space. The garage was 12 feet deep, 10 feet wide. They noted the position of the car, the angle of the wheels, the items stored in the garage. A lawnmower, gardening tools, boxes of Christmas decorations, a folded playpen. They documented everything, because in 1997, even an apparent suicide required documentation when it involved a young mother with 2 small children present. Detective Louis Morneau from the Orange County Sheriff's Office was assigned as the lead investigator. He was 41, a 14-year veteran, methodical and patient. He arrived at the scene at 12:30 p.m. and spent the next 3 hours walking through the house, the garage, the yard. He spoke with Robert Samuels in the living room while a deputy sat with the children in the kitchen. Robert sat on the edge of the couch, hands clasped between his knees. He wore work boots, jeans, a gray t-shirt with paint stains. He answered questions calmly. He said he'd left for work that morning around 5:45 a.m. He'd driven to a job site in Kissimmee, about 35 miles southwest. He'd worked until mid-morning framing walls on a new subdivision home. Around 9:30, he'd called home to ask Michelle something. What time was Kayla's doctor appointment later that week? Michelle didn't answer. He tried again at 10. No answer. He said he got worried. He said Michelle always answered. He said he told his foreman he needed to check on his family and left the job site around 10:30. He said he drove home, arrived around 11, found the garage door closed, opened it, found Michelle in the car. Detective Morneau asked why he'd opened the garage door from inside the house rather than from outside. Robert paused. He said he'd entered through the front door first, called for Michelle, then went through the interior door that connected the house to the garage. Morneau noted this. He asked if Michelle had seemed depressed lately. Robert said yes, sometimes. He said she worried about money. He said she'd been quieter than usual. He said he wished he'd paid more attention. The children were taken to Diane Forrester's house in Winter Park by a victim advocate from the sheriff's office. Diane, 51, a paralegal at a downtown law firm, stood in her driveway as the county car pulled up. She'd been told only that there'd been an incident, that Michelle was dead, that the children needed care. She took Kayla's hand and lifted Brandon from his car seat. Kayla asked where Mommy was. Diane said Mommy was sleeping. Kayla said Mommy had been in the car. Diane carried them both inside. The autopsy was performed the following day, March 18th, at the Orange County Medical Examiner's office. Dr. Rajiv Patel conducted the examination. Michelle Samuels had died from acute carbon monoxide poisoning. Her carboxyhemoglobin level was 63%, more than 6 times the level considered dangerous, well into the lethal range. There were no other injuries, no signs of struggle. Toxicology showed no alcohol, no drugs. She'd eaten breakfast. Cereal and coffee were found in her stomach. Dr. Patel noted minor bruising on her left forearm, consistent with ordinary daily contact, nothing suspicious. His preliminary finding was suicide, pending further investigation. But Detective Morneau was troubled. He returned to the scene on March 19th, 2 days after Michelle's death. He stood in the garage with the door closed, measuring, thinking. The Honda's gas tank had been 3/4 full. The car had been found in park, keys in the ignition, but something bothered him. If Michelle had intended to kill herself, why were the children buckled in their car seats? He'd seen the photos. Both children secured, ready for a drive. Why buckle your children in if you plan to poison them and yourself? He spoke with neighbors. Mrs. Chen told him about seeing Robert's truck return mid-morning. She was certain of the time, 9:47 a.m., because she'd glanced at the microwave clock when her daughter called. If Robert had left Kissimmee at 10:30, as he claimed, there was no way he could have been in the driveway at 9:47. Morneau measured the distance, 35 miles. Even without traffic, the drive took 40 minutes minimum. He interviewed Robert's foreman, a man named Eddie Kurtz. Eddie said Robert had been at the job site that morning, yes, but he couldn't say exactly when Robert left. Maybe 10:30, maybe earlier. He'd been working on a different part of the house. He hadn't noticed when Robert's truck pulled out. Morneau pulled phone records. Robert had called home at 9:34 a.m. and 10:01 a.m. from his cell phone. The calls had pinged off a tower near the Kissimmee job site, but cell tower locations could be misleading, Morneau knew. The coverage areas overlapped. He obtained the Honda's service records. The car had been inspected in January. No mechanical issues, no exhaust leaks. A car in good condition, driven into a closed garage. The engine would have needed to run for at least 15 to 20 minutes to produce lethal carbon monoxide levels in that space. Morneau timed it himself with a borrowed Honda of the same model year. 18 minutes with the garage door closed, and the CO levels were dangerously high. He spoke with Michelle's family. Diane Forrester said her daughter had not been suicidal. Yes, the marriage was troubled. Yes, Robert was controlling, but Michelle had been planning to visit that day. She'd sounded fine on the phone. She was looking forward to the park with the kids. Michelle's younger sister, Amber, 20 years old, a student at the University of Central Florida, said Michelle had been scared sometimes. She'd called Amber 2 weeks before her death and said Robert had grabbed her wrist during an argument, squeezed hard enough to leave marks. But Michelle wouldn't leave him. She said she couldn't afford to. She said he'd threatened to take the children if she tried. Those who knew Robert said he was devastated. He cried at the funeral. He held his children close. He accepted condolences from coworkers and neighbors and family friends. He made arrangements to sell the house. He couldn't live there anymore, he said. Too many memories. He moved with the children into an apartment in Altamont Springs, farther north, a fresh start. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves. Detective Morneau wrote in his case notes, timeline inconsistencies. Witness reports conflict with subject statement. Need to establish precise location of subject at Todd. But without physical evidence, without a witness, without a clear motive beyond a troubled marriage, there was only so far he could push. The medical examiner had ruled it suicide. The district attorney's office saw no grounds for charges. The case remained open but inactive. By summer, the yellow tape was gone. The house at 4382 Timber Ridge Court was sold to a young couple with no children. They repainted the walls, replaced the carpets, planted new sod in the front yard. They never knew what had happened in the garage. Clears throat. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have felt the weight of suspicion but lacked the proof to name it, you will understand what the years that followed were like for Diane Forrester. She took custody of Kayla and Brandon in April 1997, after Robert agreed it would be better for them to stay with their grandmother while he got back on his feet. He visited on weekends, took them to McDonald's, to the arcade, to the beach. He was attentive, loving. He brought gifts. He never spoke of Michelle in front of the children. But Diane watched him. She watched the way his jaw tightened when she mentioned Michelle's name. She watched the way he changed the subject when Kayla asked why Mommy went to sleep in the car. She watched the way he checked his watch during visits, always in a hurry to leave. In November 1998, 19 months after Michelle's death, Robert Samuels remarried. Her name was Crystal Hallbrook, a 24-year-old waitress he'd met at a Denny's off I-4. The wedding was small, held at a courthouse in Seminole County. Crystal moved into Robert's apartment with her daughter from a previous relationship, a 5-year-old named Emma. Robert petitioned for full custody of Kayla and Brandon. Diane fought him. The custody battle lasted 8 months and cost her $12,000 in legal fees. In July 1999, a family court judge ruled in Robert's favor. The children moved in with Robert and Crystal. Diane was granted supervised visitation twice a month. She would drive to the apartment in Altamont Springs and sit in the living room while Kayla and Brandon played on the floor. Crystal watched from the kitchen. Robert usually left errands, he said. Diane brought books, toys, homemade cookies. She asked Kayla about school, about friends. Kayla was 6 now, small for her age with her mother's dark blonde hair. She was quiet, watchful. She drew pictures, houses with big windows, families with too many arms, trees with no leaves. Brandon was 4, energetic, always moving. He didn't remember Michelle. When Diane showed him photos, he looked confused. "That's Mommy?" he'd ask. Diane would nod. He'd shrug and go back to his toy trucks. In November 2000, Crystal gave birth to a son, Robert Jr. The family moved to a 3-bedroom house in Oviedo, farther from Diane, farther from Orlando, farther from the past. Diane's visitation grew less frequent. Robert claimed scheduling conflicts. Crystal said the children were busy with school, with sports, with birthday parties. By 2001, Diane saw her grandchildren only on major holidays. She never stopped believing Robert had killed her daughter. She kept a file folder in her home office, stuffed with newspaper clippings about Michelle's death, copies of the police report she'd obtained through a public records request, notes from her own conversations with Detective Morneau. She called Morneau every few months, asking if there was anything new. There never was. Morneau retired in 2002. The case was reassigned to a younger detective who was less interested. Crystal Hallbrook Samuels knew her husband's first wife had died tragically. Robert had told her it was suicide, that Michelle had been depressed, that he blamed himself for not seeing the signs. Crystal believed him. Why wouldn't she? He was a good father, a hard worker, a provider. He'd built a life with her. They had a son together. He never raised his voice, never laid a hand on her in anger. He was gentle with the children. But there were moments. Late at night, when Robert thought she was asleep, Crystal would hear him in the garage. She'd get up, walk quietly down the hall, peer through the doorway. He'd be sitting in his truck, engine off, just sitting in the dark. She'd ask if he was okay. He'd say he was fine, just thinking. She'd go back to bed. There were nightmares. Robert would wake gasping, shaking, soaked in sweat. He never told her what the dreams were about. She stopped asking. There were the phone calls. Unknown numbers that would ring late after 10 p.m., and when Robert answered, he'd step outside, close the door behind him. When she asked who it was, he'd say work, wrong number, nothing. She wanted to believe him. Kayla, now 9 years old, began wetting the bed. She'd stopped years ago, but it started again in the spring of 2002. Crystal took her to a pediatrician. The doctor found nothing physically wrong. He suggested a therapist. Robert said no. He said Kayla would grow out of it. He said therapy was for people who couldn't handle their problems. Brandon, 7, was doing poorly in school. His teacher sent notes home about his inability to focus, his sudden outbursts, his drawings, violent scenes, figures lying down, red crayons scribbled everywhere. Crystal scheduled a parent-teacher conference. Robert didn't go. He said it was the teacher's problem, not Brandon's. Emma, Crystal's daughter, now 11, told her mother that Robert made her uncomfortable. She wouldn't say why. When Crystal pressed, Emma said he stared at her sometimes, that he asked too many questions about where she was going, who she was with. Crystal told herself she was imagining things. Robert had never hurt Emma. Robert loved Emma like his own. For those who have ever felt the slow unraveling of a life, the sense that something is deeply wrong but cannot be named, you will understand how Crystal felt in those years. She loved her husband. She feared him. She wanted to leave. She couldn't leave. They had a child together. They had a mortgage. Her name was on the lease. Where would she go? In August 2003, Crystal filed for separation. She didn't file for divorce, just separation. She moved with Emma and Robert Jr. into a rental duplex in Winter Springs. Kayla and Brandon stayed with Robert. Crystal had no legal claim to them, and she told herself they'd be fine. Robert didn't contest the separation. He seemed relieved. Diane Forrester learned of the separation from Kayla during one of their rare visits. Kayla mentioned that Crystal didn't live with them anymore. Diane asked if Kayla was okay. Kayla nodded. Then she said something Diane would never forget. Daddy said Mommy Michelle wanted to leave too, but she didn't get to. Diane drove home and called the Orange County Sheriff's Office. She asked to speak to whoever was handling Michelle's case. She was transferred 3 times before reaching a detective named Angela Reeves. Diane told her what Kayla had said. Reeves listened politely. She said she'd make a note of it. She said there was no active investigation. She said unless new evidence emerged, there was nothing they could do. New evidence emerged 16 months later. December 12, 2004. A Sunday morning. Crystal Hallbrook was in the kitchen of her Winter Springs duplex making pancakes for Robert Jr., now 4 years old. Emma, 13, was in her room doing homework. The doorbell rang at 9:23 a.m. Crystal answered. It was Kayla. She was 12 now, tall for her age, thin, wearing jeans and a sweatshirt too big for her frame. Her face was pale. Her eyes were red. She asked if she could come in. Crystal said of course. Kayla sat on the couch. Crystal sat beside her. Emma wandered out, saw Kayla, went back to her room. Robert Jr. played with blocks on the floor. Kayla said she needed to tell someone something. Crystal waited. Kayla said she remembered the day her mommy died. She said she'd been trying not to remember, but she couldn't stop. She said she had dreams about it. She said in the dreams her daddy was there. Crystal asked what she meant. Kayla said her daddy had come home that morning. She said she and Brandon were in the car, ready to go to the park. She said her mommy was in the front seat. She said her daddy opened the door and talked to mommy. She said mommy sounded scared. She said daddy told mommy to turn off the car and get out. She said mommy did. She said daddy got in the driver's seat. She said he told mommy to close the garage door. She said mommy pushed the button on the wall. She said the door came down. She said daddy started the car again. She said mommy was standing outside the car near the door to the house crying. She said daddy got out of the car and pushed mommy down. She said mommy hit her head on the concrete floor. She said mommy stopped moving. She said daddy picked mommy up and put her back in the car. She said daddy closed the car door. She said daddy walked to where the garage door button was and pushed it again, but the door didn't open. She said daddy said a bad word. She said daddy went inside the house. She said the car kept running. She said she smelled something bad. She said Brandon was crying. She said she tried to unbuckle her seatbelt but couldn't. She said she got very sleepy. She said daddy came back and opened the garage door and turned off the car and took her and Brandon out of the car and brought them inside and laid them on the living room floor. She said daddy said, "Stay here and don't say anything." She said she fell asleep. She said when she woke up, there were police and ambulances and people everywhere. Kayla stopped talking. She looked at Crystal. She said, "I remember now. I didn't want to remember, but I remember." Crystal didn't move. She asked if Kayla had told anyone else. Kayla shook her head. She said she tried to tell her daddy once when she was little, and he said she was confused that she'd had a bad dream. She said she tried to forget, but she couldn't forget anymore. Crystal called 911 at 9:41 a.m. She told the dispatcher that a child had just disclosed information about a possible homicide. The dispatcher asked for details. Crystal said it involved a 1997 death in Orlando, a woman named Michelle Samuels. The dispatcher put her on hold. 2 minutes later, the dispatcher came back and said she was transferring the call to the Orange County Sheriff's Office. Detective Angela Reeves was not working that Sunday, but she was called in. She arrived at Crystal's duplex at 11:08 a.m. with a child forensic interviewer from the county's child protection team. They spoke with Kayla for 90 minutes, recording the conversation. Kayla repeated what she'd told Crystal. She was calm. She was detailed. She was consistent. Reeves reopened the Michelle Samuels case that afternoon. She pulled the original files, read through Detective Morneau's notes, reviewed the autopsy report, examined the crime scene photos. She called Morneau at home. He was 63 now, retired, living in Vero Beach. He remembered the case. He said he'd always suspected the husband. He said he could never prove it. He said if Kayla was willing to testify, it might be enough. On December 14, 2004, Reeves obtained a warrant for Robert Samuel's cell phone records from March 1997. The records had been subpoenaed during the original investigation, but never fully analyzed. A forensic analyst at the sheriff's office spent 3 days mapping the cell tower pings. The results showed that Robert's phone had pinged off a tower on Chickasaw Trail, less than 2 miles from Timber Ridge Court, at 9:42 a.m. on March 17, 1997. He'd been in the neighborhood at the time Mrs. Chen saw his truck in the driveway. He'd lied about his location. On December 20, 2004, Reeves interviewed Eddie Kurtz, Robert's former foreman. Kurtz was 58 now, managing a different construction crew. He said he remembered that day. He said he'd told the detective back in 1997 that he wasn't sure when Robert left. Now, 7 years later, with no reason to protect Robert, he said something different. He said Robert had left the job site around 9:15 that morning. He said Robert told him he had a family emergency. He said Robert was back by noon. On January 11, 2005, the medical examiner's office reviewed Michelle Samuels' autopsy findings in light of the new evidence. Dr. Patel, still the chief medical examiner, noted that the bruising on Michelle's left forearm could be consistent with defensive injuries. He noted that the carboxyhemoglobin level suggested prolonged exposure, at least 15 to 20 minutes. He noted that if Michelle had been unconscious or incapacitated during that time, she could not have exited the vehicle. He amended his ruling from suicide to homicide. On February 3, 2005, at 6:47 a.m., Detective Angela Reeves and 4 deputies arrived at Robert Samuels' house in Oviedo. Robert answered the door in sweatpants and a t-shirt. Brandon, now 10, and Robert Jr., 4, were eating breakfast in the kitchen. Reeves identified herself and informed Robert he was under arrest for the murder of Michelle Samuels. She read him his rights. He said nothing. He didn't ask what evidence they had. He didn't ask if he could see his children. He didn't resist. He put his hands behind his back. They cuffed him. They led him to the patrol car. Brandon stood at the kitchen window watching. The arrest made the front page of the Orlando Sentinel on February 4th. Man arrested in 1997, death of wife, daughter's testimony key. The article detailed the original investigation, the ruling of suicide, the reopening of the case. It quoted Diane Forrester, who said, "I knew, I always knew." It quoted Crystal Hallbrook, who said, "I'm just glad the truth is out." It quoted neighbors from Timber Ridge Court, some of whom remembered Michelle, most of whom did not. Robert Samuels was held without bond. His attorney, a public defender named Mark Tillman, argued that the case was based on the unreliable memory of a traumatized child and circumstantial evidence. He said the medical examiner's amended ruling was influenced by external pressure. He said Robert Samuels was a grieving widower who'd been unjustly accused. The prosecution, led by Assistant State Attorney Carmen Vega, argued that Robert Samuels had murdered his wife in cold blood while his children watched. She said he'd staged it to look like suicide. She said he'd gotten away with it for nearly 8 years. She said Kayla Samuels was brave enough to come forward, and her testimony was credible. The trial began on October 3, 2005. It lasted 3 weeks. Kayla, now 13, testified on October 11th. She wore a blue dress. She sat in the witness box and answered questions for 2 hours. She described that morning in March 1997 in careful detail. She did not cry. She did not waver. She looked at her father once briefly when asked to identify the man who killed her mother. She pointed. She said, "That's him." Robert Samuels sat motionless at the defense table. The jury heard from Mrs. Dolores Chen, who testified about seeing Robert's truck at 9:47 a.m. They heard from Eddie Kurtz, who testified that Robert left the job site around 9:15. They heard from the cell phone analyst, who showed the tower pings placing Robert near the crime scene. They heard from Dr. Patel, who explained the amended cause of death. They heard from Detective Morno, who described his suspicions from the beginning. They heard from Diane Forrester, who wept on the stand and said her daughter would never have taken her own life. The defense called no witnesses. Mark Tillman argued in closing that the state's case was built on speculation and the confused memories of a child who'd been coached by bitter relatives. He said Robert Samuels was innocent. He said the jury should acquit. On October 24, 2005, after deliberating for 11 hours over 2 days, the jury returned a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. Robert Samuels showed no reaction. On December 9, 2005, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Judge Marcia Hawkins, before imposing the sentence, said, "You stole your wife's life. You stole your children's mother. You have shown no remorse. You will spend the rest of your days behind bars, as you should." Robert Samuels was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. Diane Forrester hugged Carmen Vega. Crystal Hallbrook sat in the back row, holding Robert Jr., who was too young to understand. Kayla and Brandon were not present. They were living with Diane now, had been since the arrest. They were in school that day in Winter Park, trying to live ordinary lives. Michelle Samuels was 23 years old when she died. She had been a daughter, a sister, a mother. She had liked country music and strawberry ice cream and reading novels with happy endings. She had wanted to go back to school someday, maybe study nursing. She had wanted to take her children to Disney World when they were older. She had wanted a life. Justice came, but it came slowly, carried on the fragile memory of a child who'd been brave enough to remember, brave enough to speak. For 7 years, Robert Samuels lived free while Michelle's family lived with grief and doubt and unanswered questions. The system failed them as it so often fails families like theirs. But in the end, the truth emerged. It always does if someone is willing to look for it. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.